Our next panel is our Ambassadors and Minister Roundtable. And their question is, what are the prospects for high-level coordination between Canada and the United States? Our moderator for this panel is Consul General Joseph Comartin. He's the Consul General for Canada in Detroit. And he's a lawyer. He started out his practice in Windsor, Ontario. And then he decided to go into politics. And for 15 years, he was a member of the New Democratic Party in the House of Commons in Canada. He got very strong support from the local union members with his seat in the House of Commons. He was reelected 4 times, and he was the opposition House leader from 2011 to 2012. He's now the Consul General for Canada in Detroit, and he's going to introduce his panel and lead this discussion. Joe?
Thanks, Stephen. I've been joking. I've got this cold, but I didn't get it when I was in Canada. I got it after I came to the United States, so I'm blaming Canada, or the United States for the cold. And that's because Windsor is south of Michigan, not north of Michigan or the United States, as most of the rest of the continent is divided. Let me start by introducing our panelists. First with Ambassador Blanchard, James Blanchard. I have to say I've got a whole bunch of material here on him, but the only thing that's really important is that he was the ambassador to Canada. Everything else, pales by comparison. I think you also know that he was a governor of the state of Michigan for a good number of years. He's presently practicing law as a partner and chair emeritus of the Government Affairs Practice Group in Washington. But he spends a fair amount of time both in Michigan at his cottage and in the Detroit area at his home. Our second panelist is Jim Peterson. Jim was in Parliament along with Peter. The 3 of us were in Parliament at various times together. He's a former federal minister and Secretary of State. He's currently a counsel at the law firm of Fask and Martineau. Jim, I don't know, I assume that's in Toronto. Yeah. Yep. In his role as minister, he was the Minister of International Trade, Secretary of State for International Financial Institutions. He was also chair of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance, which is probably the most powerful standing committee in our Parliament. As a former Minister of International Trade between 2003 and 2006, Jim has developed expertise in trade policy and experience in trade disputes. I think what's particularly interesting, some of the work that he did while minister. He represented Canada at the World Trade Organization's Doha round of negotiations. Those focused on expanding trade and investment in leading emerging markets, including Brazil, Russia, India, and China. It also dealt with complex issues related to trade with Canada's NAFTA partners, the European Union, the Middle East, and the Americas. So very broad base right across the globe in terms of Jim's experiences. Our third panelist is Peter MacKay. I always joke, the only thing I remember about Peter, I was also, Stephen didn't mention this, I was also Deputy Speaker of the House of Commons for the last 3 years in Parliament. I remember one time I was bugging him about judicial appointments. This is when he was Minister of Justice. And he actually tried to bribe me. He said, look, okay, well, I'll make you a judge then. And I said, Peter, that's like really improper. You shouldn't do that. And he withdrew the offer at that point. But he was the Justice Minister for a number of years. He served in the Parliament for over 18 years. I thought we had started at the same time, but you're 3 years ahead of me. He had several important ministerial positions in addition to the Minister of Justice in Canada, which is a very interesting point at this point. You're both the Attorney General and the Minister of Justice. That's a hot point in Canada right now. He was the Minister of National Defence, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Minister for Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency. In 2003, Peter was elected as the head of the Progressive Conservative Party, and at that point led the, campaign to merge the party with another Conservative party into the Conservative Party of Canada, where he became the deputy leader. He is presently, he left Parliament in 15, I think it was, or 11, 15 or 11. But he's currently serving on a number of volunteer boards. He's practicing law with a large firm in Toronto. But he serves on a whole bunch of boards, and I'm not going to list them all, but well, maybe I will. National Board of Special Olympics Canada, Boost Child Youth Advocacy Center, Wounded Warriors Canada, supports Children's Aid Society, Big Brothers Big Sisters, Acadia University, and Canada United States Law Institute, which is why he's here today. Okay, if we can start. What we did in preparation for this was to take a look, and obviously you've heard a good deal of the factual situation of what we're confronted with climate change. Obviously, we have, as politicians, as leaders right around the globe, taken a number of steps to confront this problem. I think probably the most recent one that we're all generally aware of was the Paris Agreement, determined at that point certain levels of CO2 and greenhouse gases generally that would meet. And every country in the world that signed on to the agreement had specific standards that they had to meet. Unfortunately, the United States has now indicated they're going to pull out. They actually can't do it under the agreement until 2020, but China and Russia are not major participants either on this. So that's, in terms of a framework, most of the other countries have, in fact, abided by the obligations they took on, some a bit slower than others, but it is working. The hope is that at some point the United States, China, and Russia will come on. Obviously, all three of them major emitters of greenhouse gases. I think the other interesting point in terms of setting the scene from a governance standpoint, if I can, was some of the points that John Gottfried made last night at the keynote address, and that is the work that subnational governments, municipalities, community groups, state and provinces, but governments at that level, how they have taken up the torch. They are the ones who are pushing this in a number of countries greater than the national government is. And when you see the type of information that we had from Professor Letke, it was clear indication this is a local issue. It's a world issue, but it very much impacts at the local level when you see those kind of numbers, the flooding, all the other financial consequences of climate change, that is going on at that level. So today what we're hoping to do is, from our three panelists, is have them address some of the problems they see that government officials, both elected and appointed, have in terms of dealing with the climate change. So let me start. I did send around some questions, so they've had an opportunity to prepare. I'm not springing these on these. I think the initial point that I would want to have addressed is the fact that Canada has, and the United States are going in, and I'm talking to the national governments now, are going in somewhat different directions and levels of commitment in terms of dealing with climate change. So my question is to the three panelists, and I'll start, Jim, with you. What are the implications for North America and for the globe overall by this difference between Canada and the United States?
Well, I really enjoyed the earlier presentation, also John Godfrey's last night. And also I want to thank the consulate for its continued support of this conference and of the Institute, Joe, and welcome you officially to our ranks, and Maureen as well. You all know that President Trump had his people withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. They also withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They also blamed President Obama for bugging his phones, and the United Kingdom as well, and described the current NAFTA as the worst trade agreement ever devised, and the new NAFTA the best agreement ever made. So what do we make of all this? The reality is whatever goes on at the top is going to change, in my opinion. We're going to have a new president in 2 years. We're going to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. It's a voluntary agreement anyway. States are already moving toward dealing with climate change. I think you're going to see collections of states working together along with Canadian provinces. Most businesses in the energy field, and I know I served on a board of an energy company for 17 years, are accepting the science of climate change. They may argue about how much of it's man-made, how much isn't. They're already moving to renewables. Even the big energy, big oil companies are buying up or starting solar and wind and renewable energy projects all the time. So the momentum is going to continue no matter who's in the White House. It will accelerate once we have a different president. Yeah, you know, I'm a partisan Democrat, so you'd expect me to say that. But the reality is it's going to happen. The question is whether collectively, as John Godfrey said last, collectively we can have the kind of impact that we want to have. I can tell you the new Congress, the new House has created a select committee on the climate crisis. They don't even say climate change anymore. And they're moving on legislation that may or may not be adopted in the Senate or signed by the president. But the momentum is there. Also, you know, it's interesting. Almost all the Democratic candidates for president are talking about climate change. One of them, Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington State, is making climate change the central focus of his campaign almost exclusively, which I think is also significant. But you're seeing, as I said, industry is moving dramatically from coal to natural gas. I was glad John Godfrey mentioned nuclear because I happen to think we're going to need that, and that's a sensitive matter, but I think an important one. So I think no matter what's being said in the White House, the movement toward cooperation and change and renewables and action is going to continue, and I think the younger voters also are going to insist on it. Those who are older may say, I won't be around when things really get bad. But I think young voters and millennials will play a very, very significant role in elections relating to this issue on both sides of the border.
Jim Peterson. Jim, can I ask you to address in particular from the viewpoint of Canada, vis-a-vis being the smaller of the two partners, if it's posed particular problems for the current administration in Ottawa?
Well, any time we don't act in unison on this issue, we're going to go backwards. Or we're not going to make the progress that we should be making. And so you heard earlier about the cooperation at the scientific level, but at the political level, we're going in diametrically opposed directions. And we even have some dissent in Canada from the provinces. There are 4 provinces, all conservative, which are not going along with the national effort, which had been worked out previously. Where does this leave us? Jim talked about what industry is doing in many cases and sub-governments, but I think we have to put in there, too, what is it that we as individuals can do? And just a very fast list, our air conditioning and our heaters in our homes. Can we walk and bike and take public transit as opposed to driving our car? Can we get electric cars? What about solar panels and geothermal? What about switching to green suppliers of electricity? Let me quote to you somebody. This was Alfred Russel Wallace, who wrote in 1903, Man's Place in the Universe, where he talked about the foul effusions of the Industrial Revolution and how they threaten humanity. And his concluding remarks were, vote for no one who says it cannot be done, vote only for those who declare it shall be done. And so, also, we can ask every one of our politicians at all levels, what will you do? And more importantly, what are you doing in your own life to deal with these carbon problems? Just to conclude here, both Prime Minister Thatcher and Prime Minister Blair were very concerned in their times about climate change. And I don't think it's any surprise that with leadership coming from the top like that, that some of the local councils in the UK dropped their emissions by 70%.
Peter, I think Jim's raised the issue of what's going on in Canada with the difference between, especially around the carbon tax. I don't know if I'm supposed to call it that, but the dispute over how to handle this with 4 of the provinces, Ontario leading the way, but Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and now New Brunswick, opposing the government plan. I guess somewhat along the same lines as where the president and his cabinet is leading it on the U.S. side. So, any comments on that? Sure, Joe. I'd love to take that on. And firstly, I'm glad that you did take the appointment you did. Although I think you would have been a good judge. I feel a little bit like the old Sesame Street adage. You know, one of these things is not like the other. As a conservative on this panel, and so I'm not here to defend the White House or any particular province, but what I will say is it is very much a matter of leadership, and I also very much associate myself with the former ambassador's comment about the necessity, and this isn't optional in my view, it is going to require a North American approach, and we sometimes, except in the former NAFTA, forget Mexico's role in all of this too. We're a continent, and so I think we should be also looking for ways in which we can involve Mexico, although they have bigger challenges, to be sure. The question of leadership is going to be about embracing some of the technology, in my estimation, as opposed to the forcing of responsibility on those who are perhaps least able to make the necessary adjustments. By that, I suggest that a carbon tax disproportionately hammers rural people, whereas the majority of the emissions, and look, I'm no scientist, I might be able to talk about political science, but the majority of the emissions, it would appear, are going to be coming from the bigger urban centers. And yet those who have to travel, those who have to produce food, those who are most responsible, quite frankly, for feeding the planet, are going to disproportionately pick up the slack in the proposed carbon tax arrangement. And so there's going to be court cases in Canada, in fact. That's how adamant some of the provinces differ on the approach. I like to take perhaps a different angle or tact on this, and that is trying to incentivize. Jim, I think Peterson has touched on a lot of the personal responsibility items that people can take on. But there's also ways in which government can encourage and incentivize. One of the elements that's often left out of the equation, and I talked a little bit to Dr. Tackley about this last night, is hydro. I'm very proud of the Conservative government's support for the Lower Churchill and Muskrat Falls initiative, which is the largest hydro project on the planet. And many people are not aware of that. There's enough energy upon completion to basically energize the entire east coast of North America when it comes online. It's a large, perpetual energy source. Interestingly, also, it is going to receive greater water sources because of melting water, melting ice, I should suggest. A very compelling point that was made by John Godfrey last night in his remarkable address was this perpetual election cycle, and this is where the politics very much does impact how we bring about collaboration, how we get to a unified North American approach, despite who's in the White House or who's at 24 Sussex. But we are in this campaign cycle now that begins the day after a government is elected. And the subject of governance very much impacts on whether we have a consistent approach to climate change, among many other things. But the good news is there are ample examples of where Canada, the United States in particular, have addressed big climate change issues. Acid rain is perhaps the best example that we can ever point to. There's examples of collaboration that's ongoing, and Joe, you would be very aware of the International Joint Committee, which deals specifically with some of these issues in a very unified way. I'm also encouraged, as we all should be, here we are on a university campus in this beautiful setting. The academic cooperation across border, fantastic. Chambers of commerce, non-governmental organizations are doing remarkable work in collaboration, even when governments are wrong-footing each other or not working together in a way that would bring about or accelerate, perhaps,
So it is down to a personal level. Where leadership fails in politics, I think you are seeing, thankfully, a lot of these other organizations picking up the slack. And finally, what we are seeing in technical advancement is breathtaking in terms of new ways to reduce emissions, in ways to recycle energy, to have waste-to-energy programs come online. So government can do a lot more and should do a lot more and should step up. But in the absence of that, I don't believe that all is lost. I think for certain we have tremendous leadership on so many other levels that will hopefully bring around the thought leaders at the top politically. And if not, democracy will prevail. And we may disagree on who should be driving the bus, but the people will decide.
You want to
I do. I'm optimistic in that regard as well. The tone at the top, particularly in Washington, is not good. But, you know, having served as ambassador and worked on U.S.-Canadian issues for, well, since the 70s, I worked on acid rain when I was in Congress. The cooperation of our departments, our agencies, is ongoing every day. As we speak, there are several heads of agencies or offices in Washington on the phone to Ottawa. It's at every level. The cooperation goes on and on and on, and it's very, very good. And of course, we heard about the scientific community as well. So I think that's the good thing, and that's going to continue. It would be helpful if we had a better tone at the top in Washington. I want to add 2 or 3 just miscellaneous things. Number one, having lived in Canada and been in the energy business in Canada, Canada is far more dependent. The health of Canada's economy is far more dependent on fossil fuel than the U.S. It really is. And that's a serious political challenge for any government in Canada, and it's not an easy one to deal with. I would also like to say, in terms of cooperation, Lana Pollock is here from Michigan. She's chair of the U.S. side of the International Joint Commission. 3 members from the U.S., 3 from Canada. They deal with the boundary waters and many other things, Great Lakes issues, but they obviously look at environmental impacts. And Lana's been a leader in the environmental area in Michigan. What's interesting is that Boundary Waters Treaty, which created the IJC, as I recall, was 1909. I think it's probably the first environmental agreement between 2 countries anywhere in the world. So we've been cooperating on this for a long time, and that's going to continue. The final thing I want to say is I want to brag about my nephew, who worked for years in Environment Canada, and my other nephew, his brother, who is a cardiologist teaching cardiology and hypertension at the University of Michigan Medical School. They've collaborated on the impact of air quality on cardiovascular disease. And their conclusion is not just wild swings in climate impact the health of heart and lungs, but, and I'd like to hear this from our previous speaker, short-term greenhouse gases are a severe threat to cardiovascular health. I don't ever hear anyone ever talking about the fact that climate change can have a direct impact on human health. It isn't just the change of conditions that affect our lifestyle and our business and our industry. More needs to be said about that. And the other thing that we need to talk about, because look, we're not scientists here, we're political people, government, public servants. We've got to convince the public this is really much more serious than they realize. And we've talked about that. But one way, perhaps, is to explain, look, you see how good the weather forecasters are today? They used to be lousy 20 years ago. See how good they are today? You count on them, and they're usually accurate. Well, those same people are telling us that climate change is a serious challenge. So, it's right in your face. Don't be a denier. And so that's just kind of some miscellaneous thoughts I had, other than being from Michigan. We don't need electric cars if they're powered by coal-fired plants, folks. That's a non-starter. Yep. So we need other sources.
Peter?
Well, I agree with so much of what was said, in particular the impacts on human health. And we're all trapped in our own experience. I grew up in a small town on the East Coast, and the major employers were a rail car factory, a coal-fired generator, and a tire factory, all of which were big emitters, and a pulp mill. And, you know, I hear with great alarm increasingly from people in my community that have unusual high instances of cancer. And so there's an undeniable connection to what's happening. And you only have to try to go for a jog in Beijing to realize, you know, the impact on human health and suffering is undeniable. But therein lies one of the problems, is this symbiotic relationship that we have with countries who, Joe pointed out at the outset, are not playing ball. They're not signatories to COP21 in Paris or Copenhagen or other international conventions. They are not even trying, quite frankly. They're moving in the other direction. They're building coal-fired generators in China at an alarming pace. Similarly, places like Pakistan, India, despite what they may say, and there are worse offenders as well, they're not moving in this direction. And so what do we do about that? John Godfrey's answer, I think, is the right one in part, which talks about, again, incentivizing through technology and making their economy respond out of necessity. If we can bring technological advancements, whether it's electric cars, whether it's changing how we feed the grid and making it much more economically feasible and viable, and marginalizing those countries' economies, quite frankly. I mean, again, this is not a partisan, but perhaps a regional perspective. In Canada, we hammer our oil industry, quite frankly. And there's been apocryphal statements made about the oil sands in Alberta. And so we leave it in the ground. Or we send it at a massive volume discount to the United States of America, where the United States is on the verge of surpassing the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran, if they haven't already, as becoming the world's #1 producer of energy. And we're giving our energy to the United States. And what are we doing to our own population? We're buying it from Venezuela, or indirectly from places like Iran or Saudi Arabia, and then criticizing them about their human rights. And so we're hectoring the world and telling them they have to do better on the way they pollute or treat their populations, and yet we're dependent on them for energy. When we have the capacity, we know, to not only produce it, but to refine it, and also, like the United States, be exporters. And we could refine it on the East Coast. And this also has geopolitical implications, because if Canada and the United States are able to supply places like Germany and France and Italy, they don't buy it from Russia, who invade neighboring countries and who are not interested in climate change or the effects on humans. So we have to, I think, be at least honest. I mean, we saw a very factual presentation, but we need to put facts on the table about what we're doing ourselves if we're going to realign our economies and we're going to actually take this on. Because, you know, writing a certain number at the Paris Accord as to what we're going to achieve and then coming back home and basically not doing much is like writing, you know, 200 miles an hour on the seat of your pants and saying you can run that fast. It's not going to happen.
Jim, I see that you were making notes as Peter was speaking, so I don't know if you wanted to jump in at this point.
I'd be delighted. First of all, with respect to what Jimmy said about healthcare being affected by climate change, on February the 19th, the healthcare community met in Ottawa, February 19th of this year, the doctors and nurses and everybody else, and they outlined a lot of the pathologies that are taking place because of that climate change today and how it's going to get worse in the future. Certainly what Peter said about being looking quite ridiculous, I think, in the eyes of the world. We are exporting about 3.7 billion barrels of oil, and we are importing at the same time about 1 billion barrels of oil. And we've got this incredible facility in St. John that's providing petroleum for East Coast and for Quebec and for Ontario. Anyway, it just doesn't make sense. I'd like to go back to just one thing, Joe, that John's wonderful address last night. He was asked a question afterwards about, well, how do we get the world to come on side when there are so many poor countries? And is it going to make them poorer if we start to limit carbon emissions? Well, about 15 years ago, I think it started, there was a movement that came up called Contraction and Convergence, or CNC. And it's basically, it involved what looks like somewhat like the carbon trading today. You'd have an international agreement, including all the third world and developing countries, to cap CO2 emissions in the air. Secondly, you would estimate how quickly those emissions must be cut to reach that target. Well, we've already done these two things just very recently at the meeting in Ottawa and elsewhere. Thirdly, you would create a carbon budget from those figures and divide it not among countries, but among every individual in the world, including those in the developing countries. And this would mean that those in the highly emitting industrialized countries would have to pay the developing countries money to get the credits that they would need. So that to me is not terribly alien from the cap and trade programs that we've been looking at already, but on a more limited scale. So I would just like to throw that into the bundle of tools that we might have in the future. I'm probably not as optimistic as Jim and Peter about a sanguine resolution of this whole thing. I've heard the same types of reactions back in the 2005, 2006 eras when things were proposed and planned and no actions were taken. They would have been so much easier had we started earlier, but we're now on a very steep curve of about 11 to 12 years to meet our 2030 deadline. And the trend is not great in terms of what we're doing. I think we're going to require more and more drastic actions to do it if we're going to meet those targets. And I think the world now pretty well recognizes, apart from a few skeptics and doubters, that climate change is man-made, it's of our own doing, and we're sealing our own doom. Now, what the hell are we going to do about it?
You know,
well, that's a great question.
Yeah.
What are we going to do about it?
It's interesting. You mentioned China, Russia not really being on board. The reality is we still have to lead by example, which is why we want to get things straight in Washington. We need to lead by example. And regarding China, I mentioned my nephew. His name is Dr. Jeffrey Brook. He's recently retired from Environment Canada. He now teaches at the University of Toronto. And I mentioned he was a leading expert on air quality and also the cardiovascular effects of that. So he was commissioned by the Chinese government to go to Beijing and monitor air quality before the Olympics because they were really worried that the world would arrive and you wouldn't be able to see for more than 200 yards. I mean, it's really bad there. So they banned all cars for like several months to try to get the air quality better. And he went over there and measured it for the Chinese government, brought over there. And, of course, said it was awful. But his observation was if they continue to build coal plants and other things, the health effects alone are going to start to affect their population and lifespan. And they're going to have health reasons to change their ways. It's going to be right in their face. They're not going to have a choice at some point. So it'll be interesting to see. The only other thing I want to mention is I want to mention a guy that I served with in Congress. His name was George Brown. He was a congressman from California, and he was a scientist. And he was chair of the subcommittee on environment and the atmosphere on the Science and Technology Committee. And I was a young member of that committee, and he started talking to us about climate change. And this is in the mid-'70s. And so he drafted a bill that ended up becoming the Federal Climate Program Act of 1978. Actually became law, and it called for all these studies on what's going on with climate. So George Brown knew all about this way back when. I'm glad I put my name on the bill, one of many co-sponsors. It actually became law. But even then, we had people saying, well, we're going to have a new ice age, probably. He was saying, well, the science appears to be warming, but let's look at it. Let's study it. Let's give grants to the scientific community to look at this. So there have been people, even in the political system, including George Brown of California, who were worrying about this. And they've been around a lot longer than perhaps George. But I just want to give hats off to the guy. He's no longer with us, but he was a wonderful public servant. And I'm just glad he cared about it.
Well, in that regard, Jim, I guess the dispute that's going on between the federal government on the U.S. side and the state of California in terms of what's going to be the targets for emissions and efficiency of the internal combustion engine. I mean, there's a huge gap between what is the national position and what is the state of California. We tend to be, on the Canadian side, tend to be more close to what California is trying to do, as are a number of the other states. Any sense of what the outcome of that is going to be?
I don't know. I side with California, but I don't know.
Peter?
Well, I side with California and Canada. I think that we're well beyond spinning our wheels and talking about what the causes of climate change are or whether it's real. I think everybody here, and this presentation was compelling. You wish time and time again that you could confront those who are saying it's not happening or it isn't happening as presented. You wish that you could just confront them with those facts and say, look, we have to move beyond that. To what Jim said, this is now reaching a very urgent state that's going to require action, and it is about action as opposed to the words. There's endless debate that goes on, and while we may be talking a good game, and I know, the diplomatic thing is never to disparage your own country or another country when you're a visitor, but we're talking a lot, not doing enough, and I think the United States is actually doing more and talking less, although there's a negative connotation around the discussion. And so, I remember something my grandfather used to say, the best time to plant a tree was yesterday, but we can start today. And so we should be planting a lot more trees, by the way, because that is one small thing that can be done. In places like Haiti and others, it has a massive effect on their soil and their erosion problems, and the same with the coastlines. But it's getting those great minds. If they're not political minds, get the great science minds, get those technical advancements, get the private sector, look at what works and what hasn't worked, and try to bring about greater motivation. And to that end, where I draw, I think, tremendous hope, and you can't live without hope or clean air, is millennials. Because millennials do get it. I mean, they are sometimes ridiculed by people of another generation. But there is a sense of urgency among young people that I think doesn't exist, perhaps. There's lots of notable exceptions, and we have lots of people in this room who have been at this for a long time and demonstrated leadership against, the opposition. But I think young people writ large as a generation do understand the global commitment and urgency that's going to be required, and they're going to emerge. There's going to be an emergence of leaders from that generation who are going to, as the saying goes, put this at the top of the priority list. John's point, again, who's been referenced here as our speaker last night, talked about the necessity of bringing government departments together around this issue. So it shouldn't just be the Department of the Environment, Agriculture. It has to be financed. It has to be across a whole of government approach, as he described it. That's the only way that you're going to be able to move the machinery of government to get behind the necessity of prioritizing climate change in the number of issues. The problem, of course, is that people don't want to vote against their own personal impacts. I mean, why do people smoke? Everybody knows it's going to kill you if you keep at it. But you know, when it impacts you in your own home, when you say, well, it's going to cost me more to drive to work, it's going to cost me more to get groceries, the carbon tax debate that goes on in our country is completely focused around that. And everybody would love to drive a Tesla, but it's not affordable. So maybe the government has to look at incentivizing things like public transit. They have to look at doing more in terms of recycling, incentivize people to exhibit good behavior. That's where government policy can impact. And you know, when we see electric cars, they're coming online. I was at a Stanford Energy Conference last year. These companies, these car companies get it. They know that we can't continue to produce internal combustion engines. They recognize that, and they're prescient, they're ahead of the curve, quite frankly, in many ways with their technical advances. But it's getting those advances to an affordable place and having more people make those adaptations in their day-to-day life. That's what's going to at least start incrementally bringing down the climate change.
Our recent budget, they're offering $5,000 for an electric or hybrid car under $45,000 Canadian. And I think that's a pretty good incentive. I want to say that in talking to people in Canada about what we should be doing, I've often been met with the thing, well, it really doesn't matter because the rest of the world is not in sync and we'll be doing nothing. And, but I agree completely with what Jim said, is that we got to lead by example. How are these other countries going to get into line if we're not there? If we're there, we can at least shame them into coming with us, and we can have incentives that make it good for them to do it, such as CNC maybe. I think Peter and Jim both mentioned this, how the know-how and evolution of knowledge and technology in this area is going to be perhaps a real game changer. One area where I see it right now, and it gives me a hell of a lot more hope for India and China getting on board, is taking place in a company called Global First Power, nuclear. They have, what they do is they grind up the fissionable material, the enriched uranium, into very small granules, and they coat it with graphite and silicone. Now, in so doing, there can never be a meltdown. This stuff burns at 800 degrees centigrade, 800 degrees centigrade, as opposed to 2,000 in conventional reactors, such as the 3 Mile, Chernobyl, and the Japanese, which were meltdowns. This can't melt down. Secondly, it cannot be used as weapons grade material. And thirdly, it's replaced only every 20 years as opposed to every 18 months with conventional rods. And if a terrorist attack were to take place, Yes, it would be scattered all over, but it would not be emitting any radiation. So I think something like this could be a real game changer because, as you know, it doesn't emit CO2. I'm slightly more optimistic than others are about China and India because they have such a long way to go, and these new technologies are going to be absolutely exactly what they need. And you can build them in modular sizes from anywhere from 5 megawatts up to 500. And so the price of them is going to come way down, and they will be encouraged to use these as opposed to setting up grids that don't exist for huge coal generators.
The technological advances are undeniable, and even this.
Yeah, in a minute.
Plastics.
Brief.
There's an island the size of Prince Edward Island floating around in the Atlantic, made up of plastic bottles, and it staggers the mind to think that we can't find a way to recycle in a more effective way and turn it back into energy. The Arctic ice melting, there's a really interesting company, again, not surprisingly out of California and connected to Stanford University, that has come up with a silicon-based sand that you spread over Arctic ice that slows the melting. The research there has been remarkable in demonstrating how the Arctic ice could at least, it helps to reflect the warming on the ice that's causing some of the melting. It's not going to reverse it. It's not going to stop it. But it will at least, again, if nothing else, buy us some time. So that technological edge is going to get sharper, and we need to support it and resource it and develop it if we're going to turn back this rising tide, pardon the pun.
Jim?
A couple snippets. I mentioned George Brown of California. Of course, he was in the state legislature before Congress, and smog was everywhere in the Los Angeles area. You don't hear about that now, but you can understand why people of California were much more militant about dealing with environmental issues and energy issues. I want to mention a couple other things. For those of us who forget, you know, government can have strong impact. If you look at the anti-smoking campaign and the Surgeon General reports in the United States, they had huge impact on eliminating smoking and regulating smoking areas. I mean, the same thing with seat belts. You know, when they started out with seatbelt requirement, everybody thought, well, they'll never force the drivers to use them, but it worked. So anti-smoking and seatbelt requirements are a classic case of where government with strong action can have impact. It just takes time, and you don't want to be too preachy.
Now we're telling them to use marijuana instead, smoking tobacco.
Yeah, that's a whole other... The traffic has slowed in Toronto, they tell me. So anyway, the final thing is we haven't mentioned the Green New Deal. All right, so there's like 100 members of Congress who've signed on to a resolution called the Green New Deal. I'm not sure, I've tried to look it up, and I'm not sure all that it means other than the aspirations most people feel are quite good. The critics will find stuff in there that's unrealistic, a timetable that probably is not realistic, and discredit it. But it's another example of politics and young people and leadership having an impact. It will have an impact, and it's going to affect our presidential race. So we'll see what happens. But those are all signs that people are getting really worried, particularly newer, younger members of our Congress.
Can we talk a little bit? I mean, we've got a federal election coming in Canada in October this year, and obviously the federal election on the U.S. side of the border in 2020, so a year and a half away. Any thought on what the impact is going to be of climate change as an issue in those two elections?
Polls in Canada show that it's in the top 3 issues for electors in Canada now. And I think it'll become even more so. And I think as younger people who are taking the lead on this continue to do so, parents are going to change. And so I think they will be demanding that we have people who meet this, I call it a crisis, that we're in right now.
I think it'll be a top issue for sure. If the economy continues to worsen, it drops. And that's unfortunate because I think, you know, it's been said by many people in many different spheres of influence that you can have a complementary, prosperous economy and take these necessary steps. In fact, the innovation technology piece, which requires investment, also creates prosperity and jobs and economic opportunities. That's the sort of creative piece that has to somehow be woven together with economic times, hard times, and a change to a green economy. And the problem, again, is the level of cynicism. You know, we're going to change our democratic process. We're going to do certain things within a certain budget, and then it doesn't happen. And so there's a very skeptical public when it comes to politicians, quite frankly, deservedly so. And so until you see demonstrative action, I think, on the environment, again, the problem, and there's a lot of toxicity around politics right now, but the worst thing that can happen is people say, oh, that's it, I'm out. I'm not going to vote, I'm not going to participate, I'm not going to get involved. And this is this terrible cycle that I fear we could enter. And young people have a, you know, having said I'm optimistic, and I am, there is a much shorter attention span, and with a greater sense of urgency also comes impatience. And so I fear that they're going to turn away, or they're going to look for other ways to have impact outside the political system, whether it's through NGOs, whether it's through their own work in their community. So low voter turnout is something that could be a problem in our upcoming election, I think, which is slated for October, but it could come sooner. In our system, of course, elections can be triggered by events.
We have some of those going on.
There's events happening.
Just on that point, Peter, of the, you know, that attitude, I've been involved in the environmental movement since the late 60s. And periodically it comes to the fore that I'm rejecting, I'm an environmentalist, I'm rejecting being involved in partisan politics. It doesn't do anything. Any thoughts on what we say? And it's fairly pervasive right now within the millennial generation, of just backing off and saying, I'll go and work on the community groups, on the environmental groups, but I'm not going to be involved myself on the political side to influence policy and hopefully policy that's favorable to dealing with the crisis. Any of you, as to what you say to people?
Well, you try to scare them as well as this morning's speaker scared us. And that's the best thing we can do for them at this point. Let me, in this whole debate, I'm taken back to what happened in the Second World War in the United States. There was a hell of a movement for the United States to not be involved. President Roosevelt, against the wishes of all of Congress, got the United States to be, in very quick time, the biggest supplier of tanks and planes of anybody in the world. And without that, the Second World War would probably have ended in another way. Japan made a huge mistake in getting the United States into the war. It gave them the excuse to do it. But up till then, they were just turning out the armaments that kept the Allies alive. And I think it's that type of effort that's probably going to be required. I mean, John was quite right. There's no timeline to this. Well, we have to make some timelines that people will stick to.
There is a need for leadership, for sure, from the United States. I mean, we can do our part, and I think we do to a large degree. The military comparison is interesting because the largest consumer of energy on the planet is the United States Army. When you think about it, they are the largest single consumer of energy. So there is a stated interest in having the U.S. fill the void on some of these leadership positions, which they have in the past, certainly militarily and in other spaces. And the fear that they don't is in the void. Who fills that void? Well, often it is Russia, China, some of, let's say, our less aligned, less friendly nations. So there's a concern about that. But again, I don't want to see our government or our country continue down the road of hectoring without also having the legitimacy to say we're doing our piece as well. And whether it's at a NATO table or whether it's on a climate change initiative, we have to have credibility in the world. But back to your point, Joe, about how do we ensure that young people don't turn away, your party, frankly, has been the best at engaging young people. The problem is, again, on the delivery side and having the capacity to make sure that they don't feel disappointed, that it hasn't actually lived up to the commitment. And that's where it becomes problematic. If we're not able to actually gain some ground on these important issues, there will be this continuation of low voter turnout. Jim?
I want to, again, give you some good news. The election in United States in last November had huge turnout by historical standards for a midterm election. And actually, the gains by the party out of power, my party, the Democratic Party, were equivalent of the gains during Watergate. The difference, though, is we had a relatively strong economy, and yet the Democrats made huge gains. In Michigan, the turnout was greater than any midterm election since 1962. We're trying to figure out what the youth participation was, youth being 18 to 21, 24. But I think it was up, and I think it will grow. If you do a poll now of voters, yes, the number one issue is still jobs and the economy. It usually is, but not like it used to be. It's health, which is important in the United States with all the debate about health care, universal health care, affordable health care. But the third comes up registering as climate change, which didn't used to register at all on the Richter scale. And as I mentioned to you, we have at least one candidate that's making that exclusively his campaign. So I think there are a lot of really good trends, and I think we're going to elect a new president. I think a year ago you all heard me say we were going to have big midterm gains by the Democrats. We're going to elect a new president. And all of a sudden, TPP and NATO and the Paris Climate Accord and working with trade expansion and working with the world, I'll repeat that, working with the world and Canada will be popular again because we'll have a leader who believes in that. And that's how I see it.
Okay, I lost track of time there. I thought we had a few more, but we've got about 5 minutes, so we'll take some questions over here.
Here, 1 second. Microphone. Thank you, panelists. My question is going to try to take advantage of the fact that we have an Attorney General, an Ambassador, and a former Minister of International Trade here. You have all alluded to the idea that there are significant health impacts. Last night, John Godfrey also spoke to potential climate refugees. So the big question is that we can get the machinery of government in order, but how do we get the machinery of the private sector in order? Companies have veils that protect directors from liability. So the question is, if you look at climate refugees, you look at the presentation from this morning, and we look at the potential impact at the United Nations, is this climate change or is this climate genocide? If it is a genocide and it is declared a genocide, what are the legal and trade ramifications of that?
Well, I'll take a shot at that. I mean, that's a massively important question. Part of the answer is, of course, the movement towards more corporate social responsibilities. And the UN has their social development goals, which are aspirational. And in short, there has to be more enforcement. and more sanction around that. And at the top of these social responsibility goals, to your point, has to be efforts of enforcement around being good climate citizens to prevent the type of displacement that we're seeing, which is massive displacement, in large part because of conflict. And again, it's interesting to look at some of the military studies. Some of the best minds around social change and climate change actually are people who have served in uniform, because they've been in many parts of the world where they've seen the impact. And they have come to the inevitable conclusion that we're on this catastrophic track. Shortages of water may be the cause of the next big world conflict. They themselves, as military, are also big consumers of energy, and they know that that's the way, from a military standpoint, that you keep the advantage. If you have the ability to mobilize and to make advances ahead of your enemy, you win the day. But I remember something General Mattis said in the context of the Iraq-Afghanistan conflicts. He said the most important 6 inches on the battlefield are between the soldiers' ears, which is applicable across, any subject. It's, how we're thinking about these things. So to answer your question from a justice perspective, I think we need more enforcement. On the emitters, the big emitters, I think there needs to be punishment, quite frankly, for those who pollute and those who take advantage, as there has to be on those who participate in human trafficking or who have exploitative practices in labor. There has to be a consequence. I'd rather see more emphasis on the incentivization, but if you're on the other side of criminal behavior, there's a sanction. And that has to be in the corporate world as well. To your point, corporate liability now can make its way all the way back to the boardroom. And I referenced my community. We had a mine that blew up in my community that killed 26 men. And they tried to prosecute the company. And the whole prosecution ultimately collapsed under the weight and the complexities and the delays. And so our laws have not been keeping pace with that imperative to hold corporate companies and their boards of directors and the decision makers, allowing them to hide behind the corporate veil, has got to stop.
Isn't there an action right now against Exxon in the courts because they understated the impact on climate change? Pardon? Okay.
Well, Volkswagen is a good example.
I think there's an investigation in New York State with the Attorney General on that. I'm not positive, but yes, the answer is I think so, at the state level.
Okay, this will have to be the last question because we're out of time.
Thank you for a very interesting panel. My question focuses on the discussion of the carbon tax, and there was a report from CDP a couple of years ago showing that 100 companies were responsible for something like 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So I guess my question is, if you don't have a carbon tax, aren't you kind of letting those companies and other large fossil fuel emitters continue with externalities, which are kind of another way of saying freeloading and not paying their costs? And shouldn't we be doing that?
I think you're making a very strong case for putting a price on carbon. Everybody, or I think most big businesses, would accept it. I think the question is, under our federal program now, it comes on at $20 and goes up to $50 in 2022. There are many critics who are saying it will not have an impact unless you take it to $200 a ton. So let's see. At least the government can reevaluate what it's doing in a couple of years to see if it's working.
The trouble with an across-the-board carbon tax in a country like Canada is we have a relatively small population for a massive geography, and we're a cold country. So we're putting tax on people who live in a cold climate that don't have an option but to heat their house, so it's very punitive. And you're going after a significant population that live in rural communities that have to drive to go to work, that have to heat their homes. They don't have the option to use perhaps natural gas or in some cases alternative sources of energy. And so currently you have 3% of the Canadian population, 3%, paying 3/4 of the tax for the entire country's revenue. And so you're disproportionately hitting a population, in my view, without taking the broader view that you need to put that burden to a larger degree on the emitters and on the source, as opposed to those who are just trying to scrape by and make a living and drive their pickup truck 200 miles down the road to go to work. And so it's a fairness issue, as I see it. I think there are cap-and-trade solutions. There are incentives that can be given in urban centers that can never apply to rural communities. And so I guess, again, you look at it from where you sit. And I represented a rural community of fishermen, farmers, people who basically could least afford to pay more tax because they're already paying a lot of tax.
Okay, on that note, please join with me in thanking the panelists for their contribution.